"Have a safe trip," my sister said, and she hugged me so tight I could feel her heart pounding against mine. I remember thinking it was strange because I was the one staying and she was the one getting on the plane. 30 seconds after her flight number was called at gate 12, my phone rang. It was a loan officer from a company called Sterling Bridge Capital, calling to confirm a $340,000 loan I had never applied for, secured against a house I had never seen, signed with a signature that was mine and wasn't mine at the same time. I stood there holding my boarding pass stub in one hand and my phone in the other, watching my sister's plane push back from the gate through the window, and I understood something she did not want me to understand yet. She wasn't leaving for a new job in Denver. She was leaving before I found out what she had done to get there. I didn't cry. I didn't call her name. I wrote down the loan number on the back of a parking receipt, and I started walking toward the security office because the woman on the phone had just used the word fraud, and I happened to know exactly what that word meant, better than almost anyone she could have called that morning. If you're watching this on your lunch break with your phone propped against a coffee cup, or half asleep in bed with the volume down low so you don't wake anyone up, tell me where in the world you're watching from before we start. I read every single comment. My name is Claire Bennett, and for 11 years, my sister Vanessa was the person I trusted most in the world. This is the story of what she took from me at gate 12, what she didn't know I could find, and what happened to her and to my husband once I decided to stop being the sister who forgives and start being the one thing neither of them ever thought I still was. Before I tell you what happened at the airport, you need to understand who I was before that morning, because none of what came later makes sense without it. I grew up the responsible one. That's not me bragging. It's just a fact of birth order and temperament. Vanessa is 2 years younger than me. And from the time we were kids, she was the one who forgot her homework, lost her house key, missed the bus, and somehow always landed on her feet anyway. Usually because I'd already fixed the problem before our parents noticed. I didn't resent it back then. I thought that was just what older sisters did. I went into finance almost by accident. In college, I took one accounting class to fill a requirement and discovered I had a strange gift for spotting the place where numbers stopped telling the truth. A ledger that balanced perfectly on the surface but had a seam underneath, like wallpaper hiding a crack in the wall. That gift took me into a field most people don't think about until it happens to them: identity and title fraud investigation. For 9 years, I worked for a firm that contracted with banks and title companies to catch people who forged signatures, stole identities, and slipped fake documents into real estate closings when nobody was looking closely enough. I was good at it. I want to say that plainly without false modesty because it matters later. I could look at a notarized signature and tell you, more often than not, whether the pen pressure changed halfway through, whether the loop on a capital letter had been practiced, whether a stamp had been applied at an angle that suggested someone was in a hurry to make it look official. I left that job 4 years ago when my son was born, not because I stopped caring about the work, but because 80-hour weeks and a newborn don't share a calendar. I kept my license active. I kept a handful of old contacts. And twice a year, quietly, I took on a small consulting case for a friend of a friend who needed a second set of eyes on a document nobody else trusted. My husband Mark called it my little hobby. I let him call it that because it was easier than explaining that I missed it. Mark and I had been married for 8 years by then. He worked in commercial insurance, steady but not spectacular, the kind of job that pays the mortgage and not much more. 2 years before the airport, his company had gone through layoffs, and Mark had been one of the ones who survived, but with his hours cut and his commissions gone. He never said much about money. I noticed the silence more than I noticed any actual conversation about it, and looking back, silence should have told me more than it did. Vanessa moved to our city 6 years ago, right after her first marriage ended, and she stayed in our guest room for 4 months while she got back on her feet. I didn't think twice about it. She was my sister. She got a job in property management, then in real estate marketing. Then somewhere along the way, she started dating a man named Gordon Cole, a quiet, decent man who owned a small chain of hardware stores and adored her in a way that made our whole family relax a little, because for once Vanessa had landed somewhere stable instead of somewhere exciting. They married 3 years ago. I stood up as her matron of honor. I gave a toast about how far she'd come. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that somewhere in those years of moving between jobs and apartments, Vanessa had become close with a woman named Denise Pruitt, a notary and escrow officer who worked at a company called Coastal Ridge Title and Escrow. Denise handled closings for Sterling Bridge Capital, a private lender that specialized in fast, low documentation loans for buyers who didn't want to wait on traditional banks. Vanessa met Denise through a real estate deal 2 years back, and the two of them stayed friendly the way people do when one of them might someday be useful to the other. I met Denise exactly once, at a barbecue at Vanessa's house, and I remember her complimenting my handwriting on a birthday card I'd brought, telling me I had a lovely, distinctive signature. I remember laughing and saying it was the one thing about me that hadn't changed since high school. I didn't think about that conversation again until it was much too late to matter. The detail that I need you to hold on to, the one that becomes important later, is this. 4 years ago, when Mark and I refinanced our house, I had signed a stack of documents at our kitchen table with Denise Pruitt sitting across from us as the notary. Because Vanessa had recommended her, said she was fast and cheap and would come to the house instead of making us drive to an office. Denise had watched me sign my name maybe a dozen times that evening. She had my driver's license number from that closing. She had a photocopy of my signature on file, legally, sitting in an escrow company's records for exactly this kind of moment. I didn't know any of that at the time, of course. All I knew 3 months before the airport was that Vanessa had gotten a new job offer in Denver, a promotion at a regional property management firm, and that she and Gordon had decided she should go ahead of him to get settled while he wound down the sale of one of his stores. She talked about the move constantly. New job, new city, new start. She cried at dinner one night talking about how much she'd miss us. I remember thinking she seemed more emotional about this move than any of her others, and I remember thinking it was sweet, that maybe she'd finally grown into the kind of person who let herself feel things instead of running from them. I drove her to the airport myself on a Tuesday morning in March. Mark said he had an early client call and couldn't come. I didn't think anything of it. I want you to remember that I didn't think anything of it, because that detail matters too. The security office at the airport was small, just a folding table and a tired-looking guard who clearly did not know what to do with the woman standing in front of him, calm-voiced, explaining that she'd just been notified of a fraudulent loan in her name. He gave me a phone number for airport police, who gave me a phone number for the local fraud division, who told me, not unkindly, that this wasn't really an airport matter at all, that I needed to call the lender directly and start a paper trail. So, I did the only thing that made sense to me in that moment. I called Sterling Bridge Capital back. The loan officer, a young man named Curtis, was apologetic and confused in equal measure. He read me the loan number again. $340,000, closed 11 days earlier, secured against a property on Tillamook Bay Road in Oregon, a 3-bedroom house 40 yards from the water. The borrower of record was Claire Marie Bennett, my full legal name, my correct date of birth, my correct social security number. The closing had happened remotely, notarized by a Denise Pruitt of Coastal Ridge Title and Escrow, with wiring instructions sent to an account under a name I didn't recognize at the time, an LLC called Driftwood Point Holdings. I asked Curtis to email me the closing package immediately, every page, every signature. He said he'd need to verify my identity first, which under any other circumstance would have made me laugh, given that someone had apparently already verified an entire fake version of my identity 11 days earlier without my knowledge. He sent the package within the hour. I didn't open it in the airport parking garage. I sat in my car for 11 minutes without touching my phone, which is not something I usually do, but I needed those 11 minutes to stop shaking before I looked at anything with a professional eye instead of a wounded one. When I finally opened the file, I saw my signature on the promissory note, and it was good. Whoever had signed it had practiced. The slant was close, the loop on the C in Claire was close, but the pressure was wrong, heavier at the start of each word and lighter at the end, the opposite of how I actually write, because I was taught cursive by a left-handed teacher who dragged her pen instead of pushing it. It's the kind of detail that means nothing to almost anyone on earth and meant everything to me. I called Mark before I called anyone else because my first thought, the only thought that made sense at the time, was that someone had stolen both of our identities, that we were victims together, that we needed to face this side by side. He didn't pick up. I called again. Nothing. I texted him one line. Someone took out a loan in my name. Call me now. 40 minutes passed before he called back, and when he did, his voice had a strange flatness to it, a carefulness, like a man picking his way across ice he already knew was cracked. He said he didn't know anything about it. He said it twice, which I noticed even then, because innocent people usually only say a thing once. I want to walk you through the next 9 days plainly, because they didn't happen all at once. They happened in layers, each one peeling back to reveal something worse underneath. And I think that's important for you to understand if you've ever had the sick, sinking realization that the person lying to you has been doing it for longer than you think. Layer 1 came the same afternoon. I called Gordon, Vanessa's husband, thinking he might know something about her sudden move, only to learn that Gordon hadn't spoken to Vanessa in 5 days and thought she was traveling for work training, not relocating. He didn't know she'd resigned from her job 2 weeks earlier. He didn't know she'd taken $40,000 out of their joint savings account, the money he thought was earmarked for the sale of his second store. Gordon's confusion was real. I could hear it cracking in his voice over the phone, and it was the first sign that whatever was happening was bigger than a loan in my name, that it had architecture, that more than one person had been kept in the dark on purpose. Layer 2 came 2 days later, when I drove to the house Mark and I shared to find half his closet empty and a note on the kitchen counter, not even a full page, telling me he was sorry, that he'd fallen in love with someone and he didn't know how to say it to my face, that he hoped I could understand someday. He didn't name her. He didn't have to. I already knew. The way you know a storm has arrived not from the first drop of rain, but from the sudden, total silence beforehand. Layer 3 came from my mother, 3 days after that, when I finally worked up the nerve to ask her, gently, whether Vanessa and Mark had seemed close lately. My mother went quiet in a way that told me everything before she said a single word, and then she admitted that she'd seen them having lunch together twice in the past 2 months, that she'd assumed it was about planning a surprise for my 40th birthday, still a year away, and that she hadn't thought to mention it because why would she? My mother wasn't hiding anything. She was just another person who hadn't been given enough pieces to see the picture. The worst layer, the one that actually made me sit down on my kitchen floor for the first time in this entire ordeal, came when I finally got Denise Pruitt's direct line from the closing documents and called her, posing at first as a confused client rather than the fraud victim, an old professional habit that served me well. Denise, thinking she was talking to someone from the lender's compliance department doing a routine callback, mentioned offhand that the seller's agent on the Tillamook Bay property had been thrilled the closing moved so fast, since the buyer, and here she used the phrase my sister's team, had wanted to be in before summer. My sister's team. Not my sister and her husband. My sister's team, which meant Denise had known all along whose money this actually was, and had helped hide it behind my name anyway. I hung up and sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and did the math out loud, alone, in an empty house, because doing math out loud has always been the way I calm myself down. $340,000. A $40,000 withdrawal from Gordon's savings that didn't match the loan amount, which meant there was a gap somewhere I hadn't found yet. A closing that happened 11 days before my sister boarded a plane and hugged me so hard I could feel her heart pounding, because of course it was pounding. She was standing in an airport holding a boarding pass to a life she'd built by erasing me out of my own name. I didn't call her. I didn't text her. I did the one thing that 4 years away from the job hadn't managed to erase from me, the thing that had once been my entire career. I opened a blank document on my laptop and I started writing down everything I knew, in order, with dates, the way I used to build a case file for people who never expected to get caught. I want to be honest with you about something. In movies, the wrong spouse always seems to stumble onto a hidden folder or a secret phone at exactly the right moment, and everything unravels in one dramatic afternoon. That is not how it works. Real evidence takes real time, real paperwork, and in my case, it took exactly the skill set I had spent 9 years building and 4 years pretending I didn't miss. The first thing I did the morning after I sat on my kitchen floor doing math was call a woman named Priya Aluwalia, my old supervisor at the fraud investigation firm. I hadn't worked a case with her in 4 years, but my license was still active, and more importantly, she still trusted me. I told her everything. She didn't gasp or sympathize the way a friend would. She asked me the questions a professional asks, which was exactly what I needed. Had I filed a police report yet? Had I contacted the credit bureaus to freeze my file? Had I pulled the county recorder's records on the Tillamook Bay property to see the deed itself, not just the loan documents Sterling Bridge had sent me? I hadn't done that last one yet, so I did it that afternoon. Oregon County deed records are public, which people forget, and within 20 minutes I had the recorded deed for the Tillamook Bay Road property pulled up on my screen. The grant deed listed the buyer as Claire M. Bennett, an unmarried woman, which was its own small, cold insult, since I was very much married at the time of the closing. A detail either overlooked or deliberately chosen because a married status would have required Mark's signature too, and Mark wasn't ready to put his name on paper yet. That detail alone told me something important. Whoever had structured this, and I no longer believed it was Vanessa acting alone, had thought through the legal mechanics carefully enough to keep Mark's name off the property entirely, which meant either a very organized affair, or someone advising them who understood real estate law better than two people having lunch twice a month should have. Priya connected me with a document examiner she still worked with named Robert Suzuki, a forensic handwriting analyst I'd collaborated with on maybe a dozen cases years earlier. I sent him high-resolution scans of my signature from the fraudulent loan documents alongside 3 verified samples of my real signature, including one from that same refinance closing 4 years earlier where Denise Pruitt had watched me sign. Robert's report came back 5 days later, 11 pages of pressure analysis, letter formation comparison, and stroke sequencing, concluding with what I already knew in my gut, but now had in writing from a credentialed third party. The signature on the Sterling Bridge loan documents was a highly competent forgery, likely produced by someone with direct access to multiple genuine specimens of my signature, and likely traced or closely rehearsed rather than freehand. That word, specimens, is what sent me back to the refinance closing 4 years earlier, and to Denise Pruitt specifically. As a notary, Denise was legally required to keep a journal of every signing she witnessed, including a thumbprint and a copy of the ID presented, for a minimum number of years depending on state requirements. That journal wasn't public, but it was subpoenable, and more importantly, it was the exact kind of document I used to request routinely in my old job through a formal records request once a police report existed. Which meant my next move was clear. I needed the police report to become real, not just a phone call to a confused local officer. So I needed to escalate this from a service call to a federal matter, because the wire transfer had crossed state lines from an Oregon lender to an LLC account, and interstate wire fraud isn't a local police case. It's an FBI case. I drove to the local FBI field office in person rather than calling, because I'd learned in my old job that walk-in fraud complaints with an organized, dated written summary get taken far more seriously than a phone tip. I handed the agent at the front desk 14 pages I'd typed over the previous week. Timeline, dollar figures, deed records, Robert's forensic report, and a printed copy of my text with Gordon establishing that $40,000 had left his and Vanessa's joint account 9 days before the loan closed. The agent who eventually took my case, a woman named Special Agent Patricia Ruiz, told me something that made the whole picture finally click into place for me. $40,000 in cash as a down payment, plus a $340,000 loan, added up almost exactly to the full purchase price plus closing costs on a $375,000 house. Vanessa hadn't needed my identity because she lacked money. She needed it because with only $40,000 in hand and a fresh resignation from her job, she and Mark couldn't have qualified for a loan of that size on their own credit. Not quickly, not without months of underwriting scrutiny that a low documentation private lender like Sterling Bridge could skip, provided the borrower on paper had a clean, stable financial history. Mine. I sat with that for a long moment in Agent Ruiz's office. My sister hadn't picked my name out of convenience or spite alone. She picked it because I was on paper the safest, most bankable version of a Bennett that existed, and she had spent our entire lives watching me be exactly that person, reliable, careful, easy to borrow against, in every sense of the word. The investigation moved faster once the FBI opened a file. But I want to be clear that this wasn't instant either. Federal wire fraud investigations take weeks at minimum to build properly, gathering bank records under subpoena, requesting the notary journal from Coastal Ridge Title, tracing the Driftwood Point Holdings LLC back to its registered agent, which turned out, unsurprisingly, to be Mark. Agent Ruiz asked me during this period to do something that took more discipline than anything else in this whole ordeal. She asked me to say nothing to Vanessa, nothing to Mark, and to behave if either of them contacted me, as though I still didn't know the full picture. Premature confrontation, she told me, was the single most common way these cases fell apart because people panic and destroy records the moment they realize they've been caught. So for 5 weeks, I went quiet in a way that must have looked to anyone watching like grief instead of strategy. I answered Mark's occasional guilt-ridden texts with short, neutral replies. I let my mother believe I was simply too devastated to talk about Vanessa. I filed for divorce from Mark on entirely separate, ordinary grounds, irreconcilable differences, because Oregon law requires a minimum 90-day waiting period from the date of filing before a divorce can be finalized regardless of the circumstances, and I intended to use every single one of those 90 days. What Vanessa didn't know, sitting in her new house 40 yards from the water in a town where nobody knew her name yet, was that her own husband, my brother-in-law Gordon, had by week 3 become one of Agent Ruiz's most cooperative witnesses, once he understood exactly where his $40,000 had actually gone. Gordon hadn't been part of the plan. Gordon had been robbed too, just more quietly, and once he understood that, he wanted answers as badly as I did. By the start of week 6, I had what Agent Ruiz called, with the flat understatement federal agents seem to specialize in, a strong case. Forged signatures with a matching notary opportunity. A shell LLC registered to Mark. A withdrawal trail from Gordon's account. A recorded phone admission from Denise Pruitt, unknowingly given to a woman she thought was a stranger from compliance. And one more piece, the piece that would let me choose exactly how and exactly where I wanted the truth to come out. Vanessa had sent our mother an invitation 2 weeks earlier to a housewarming dinner at the Tillamook Bay House, a small gathering to celebrate the new place. Family only, she'd written, as if family were a word she still had any right to use with me. The dinner was set for the second Saturday in June. Gordon, still officially married to Vanessa and still, as far as she knew, in the dark about everything, would be there. My mother would be there. And with Agent Ruiz's blessing, once she confirmed the case was solid enough that nothing I did could jeopardize it, I decided I would be there too. The Tillamook Bay House was exactly as pretty as I'd imagined it from the deed records, which is a strange thing to say. But by that point, I'd looked at the square footage and the lot dimensions so many times that seeing the actual building felt almost anticlimactic. Gray shingles, white trim, a deck facing the water, the kind of house featured in magazines about coastal living. I arrived 40 minutes after the dinner started, on purpose, driving up from the airport where I'd landed only 2 hours earlier, because Agent Ruiz had asked me to wait for a text confirming that a second team, an Oregon-based agent working with her office, was in position nearby before I walked through that door. My mother saw me first. She was standing near the kitchen island with a glass of wine she wasn't really drinking, and her face did something complicated when she spotted me, relief and confusion arriving at the same time, because she'd been told I wasn't coming, that I was too raw to be around Vanessa yet. Gordon saw me next, from across the room, and unlike everyone else, his face didn't do anything complicated at all. He simply nodded once, a small, steady nod, the nod of a man who had known exactly what tonight was going to be for 3 weeks and had chosen to be here anyway. Vanessa was the last to notice me because she was in the kitchen plating something, laughing at whatever Mark had just said to her. And when she turned around and saw me standing in her front hallway, the laugh didn't just stop. It seemed to physically leave her face, like something had reached in and taken it back. I didn't raise my voice. I want you to understand that because I think people expect a scene like this to be loud, and mine wasn't, not at first. I said her name, just her name, Vanessa, and I watched her set down the serving spoon she was holding with the exaggerated care of someone whose hands have suddenly stopped obeying her. Mark's reaction came a half second after hers, and it was different in a way I noticed even through everything else happening in that room. Where Vanessa froze, Mark moved, stepping half in front of her, an old, useless instinct from a marriage that no longer belonged to him, and started talking immediately. Fast. The way people talk when they're trying to fill the silence before someone else can fill it with something worse. He said my name. He said this wasn't the place. He said we could talk about this like adults somewhere private. I told him there wasn't going to be a private conversation, not this time, because for 5 weeks I'd had a great many private conversations with people who understood far better than he did what he and my sister had actually done. And then I said the sentence I had planned for 3 weeks, revised a dozen times, and finally settled on because it was true, and because it was exactly precisely the amount of information that room needed to hear all at once. I told them that $340,000 had been borrowed against my name and my credit for a house I was standing in for the first time in my life, that the loan had been secured with a forged signature notarized by a woman named Denise Pruitt, who had access to my genuine signature from a closing 4 years earlier, and that the down payment had come from $40,000 quietly withdrawn from an account Gordon still believed was intact. The room went still in a way I've never experienced before or since. My mother's wine glass tilted slightly in her hand, forgotten. And Gordon, who had known this was coming, still visibly flinched at hearing the exact number said out loud in his own future ex-wife's kitchen. Vanessa's reaction, once her voice finally came back, wasn't denial. I think that surprised me most of anything that night. She didn't say I was lying. She said, in a voice gone thin and fast, that she'd always planned to tell me that she was going to pay me back once the Denver job signing bonus came through, that it was never supposed to hurt me. It was just supposed to be temporary, borrowed, a bridge, as if a felony could be softened into an unfortunate loan between sisters simply by insisting hard enough that it was one. I let her talk. I let her run out of words on her own, because I already knew from Agent Ruiz that everything she said in that kitchen with me standing there was information, not confession. Since I wasn't law enforcement and couldn't Mirandize anyone, but every word still mattered, because 2 people near that doorway happened to have their phones out recording video of the party earlier and never stopped, a detail I hadn't planned and couldn't have, but one that would matter a great deal 3 weeks later. Mark's collapse looked different from Vanessa's. Where she talked, he went quiet, sitting down hard on one of the bar stools like his legs had simply stopped being willing to hold him. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't to me. It was to Gordon. He said Gordon's name like an apology, which told me something ugly and specific, that whatever guilt Mark carried, he carried more of it toward the husband he'd betrayed alongside my sister than toward the wife he'd betrayed directly. And I remember thinking quite clearly, standing in that kitchen, that I no longer cared what Mark felt guilty about at all. Denise Pruitt wasn't at the dinner. I hadn't expected her to be. But Gordon, 3 days earlier, at Agent Ruiz's instruction, had casually mentioned to Vanessa that Denise was thinking about handling escrow on a future rental property he was considering, a lie designed to keep Denise's name circulating naturally in conversation without raising alarm, and Vanessa, unknowingly, had texted Denise that same week to say Gordon might be reaching out. That single text, later pulled under subpoena, placed Denise inside the timeline of the family's awareness in a way that closed the last gap in Agent Ruiz's case, proving Denise's ongoing relationship with the family wasn't incidental to the fraud. It was continuous with it. The FBI didn't storm through the front door that night, because that isn't how these cases work outside of television, and I want to be honest about that instead of giving you a more dramatic version. What happened instead was quieter, and in its own way, more final. 2 days later, Special Agent Ruiz and a colleague arrived at the Tillamook Bay house with a search warrant, seizing laptops, the LLC formation documents for Driftwood Point Holdings, and Mark's phone, which contained, among other things, text messages between him and Vanessa dating back 14 months, well before Gordon's savings account or my signature had ever entered the picture. Messages that made clear the affair had started long before either of them decided my identity was a resource worth spending. Denise Pruitt was interviewed at Coastal Ridge Title and Escrow's offices that same week, and unlike Vanessa, she did not run out of words slowly. She stopped talking almost immediately and asked for a lawyer, which her employer, once informed of the subpoena, treated as sufficient grounds to suspend her notary commission pending investigation, effectively ending on the spot, a career she'd spent 11 years building. Gordon filed for divorce from Vanessa the same week the warrant was executed, citing the financial deception specifically, which under Oregon law meant his case could move somewhat faster on the property division front, since dissipation of marital assets, meaning one spouse secretly spending shared money without the other's knowledge or consent, is treated as a distinct and provable claim, not just a garden variety irreconcilable difference. My own divorce from Mark had already been filed 5 weeks earlier on the neutral grounds I'd chosen deliberately, but I amended the filing that same week to add the fraud allegations formally, once Agent Ruiz confirmed doing so wouldn't compromise the federal case. Oregon's 90-day minimum waiting period meant neither divorce was finalized quickly, no matter how much either of us might have wanted it to be. And I want to say clearly, because so many people watching these stories expect an instant, cinematic ending, that there wasn't one. There was a summer of depositions, financial disclosures, and increasingly desperate phone calls from my mother trying to hold together a family that had already, functionally, come apart the moment my sister decided my name was worth more to her as a tool than as a person. I'm going to tell you how this ended the way Agent Ruiz eventually told me she preferred to close out her reports. Plainly, without softening anything, because I think after everything I've told you, you've earned the plain version instead of a tidy one. Vanessa was indicted 11 months after that dinner on charges of wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The second charge carrying a mandatory minimum sentence under federal law separate from whatever sentence the underlying fraud itself received, because Congress wrote that law specifically for cases where someone's identity is stolen and used as the instrument of a larger crime, not just as an incidental detail of one. She took a plea agreement rather than go to trial. Once the forensic handwriting report, the notary journal, and 14 months of text messages made the outcome of a trial fairly predictable. She was sentenced to 31 months in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution, jointly and severally with Mark, for the full $340,000 plus my legal costs and Robert Suzuki's forensic examination fees. Mark pled guilty to a lesser but still felony charge of bank fraud, having been the one who formed the Driftwood Point Holdings LLC and directed the wire transfer, and received 18 months, along with the same restitution obligation. I want to tell you I felt something enormous when I read his sentencing outcome. Mostly what I felt was tired. The specific tiredness of someone who has spent over a year being right about something she desperately wished she'd been wrong about instead. Denise Pruitt lost her notary commission permanently and was charged separately with facilitating fraud through her notarial duties, a charge that carries real weight in a profession built entirely on the public trusting that a notary stamp means what it claims to mean. She avoided prison through a plea to a lesser offense involving probation and a permanent professional bar, but 11 years of career gone, because the one thing a notary is never, under any circumstance, supposed to do is verify a signature they have reason to know is not genuine. The Tillamook Bay house was sold at foreclosure 14 months after that dinner, once it became clear neither Vanessa nor Mark could maintain payments on a loan built on fraud in the first place, and the proceeds went, in part, toward the restitution I was owed. I never went back to see it after that Saturday night. I didn't need to. I'd already gotten everything from that house that I ever actually wanted from it, which was the truth said out loud in front of the people who needed to hear it. Gordon and I stayed close. In the particular, careful way two people stay close when the only thing that originally connected them has been removed from both their lives. He remarried 2 years later. Someone steady, someone boring in the specific, wonderful way that people become attractive to you only after you've survived something genuinely exciting and terrible. We still get coffee sometimes. He's one of maybe 4 people alive who understands, without me having to explain it, why I still double-check every signature line on every document that crosses my desk, even the harmless ones, even now. My mother took the longest to recover, not because she was implicated in anything, but because she spent the better part of 2 years trying to find a version of the story where she still got to have 2 daughters instead of 1. And eventually she had to accept that the version where Vanessa remained her daughter and the version where I remained safe were not, in the end, compatible outcomes. She visits Vanessa in prison twice a year. I've never asked her not to. That's not my forgiveness to withhold or extend on my mother's behalf. As for me, I went back to work full-time about 8 months after the airport, not out of financial necessity, since the restitution and the divorce settlement left me stable, but because I discovered something during those 5 quiet weeks of building a case against my own family that I hadn't let myself admit in the 4 years before it. I hadn't left the work because I stopped loving it. I'd left it because I'd let myself believe, the way a lot of women my age get talked into believing, that loving something demanding and difficult was somehow incompatible with loving my family well. Vanessa taught me in the worst possible way that the opposite was true. It was the work I'd set aside, the sharp, careful, suspicious part of my mind I'd tried to soften for 8 years of marriage that ended up being the only part of me strong enough to protect what was left of my life once someone I trusted decided to take it apart. I don't have a neat lesson to hand you at the end of this, the kind you've probably heard at the close of a dozen other stories like mine. I'm not going to tell you never to trust your family, because I still trust my mother and I still trust Gordon, and trust was never really the thing that failed me. What failed me was believing that closeness and safety are the same thing, that the people who know you best are, by definition, the people least capable of hurting you, when in fact it's usually the opposite. The people who know you best are the only ones who know exactly where to aim. If you're listening to this at gate 12 of your own life right now, whatever that gate looks like for you, I hope you hold on to this one small, unglamorous piece of advice instead. Keep your own paperwork. Know your own signature better than anyone else does. And if something in your gut tells you a goodbye hug lasted a few seconds too long, trust that feeling completely, because mine was right and I only wish I'd listened to it while she was still standing in front of me, instead of after her plane had already left the ground.